Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm John Kasparian, the Interim Dean of Architecture, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the second faculty presentation in our Noon Talks, part of our fall lecture series. I would like to again start by thanking the committee who organized these lectures, chaired by Assistant Professor Sarah Nichols and Brittany Udding, and the staff members who are helping implement them, especially Christine Worley. As usual, following the lecture, one of the student members of the committee, and I believe it's Z today, will conduct the questions and answers. I would also like to mention that all lectures are recorded and can be found on the Rice Design Alliance website. The theme of our series, as you know, race, social justice, and allyship, not only initiates a long overdue discussion about these topics in the school, but it is our very first step in a response to the ever more urgent concerns of our extended community, that we act decisively in implementing long-term change in the ways we recruit, educate, and foster future generations of architects. Last year, I initiated these faculty noon talks to give my colleagues an opportunity to introduce themselves to a wider audience than just their own students, and to share their research and interests in advancing our common conversation within the school. This year, I've also asked my colleagues to address the relevance of the theme of the lecture series in their own work. It is indeed my great pleasure to introduce Stephen Fox today, a lecturer in the School of Architecture who also teaches at U of H College of Architecture. He is a fellow of the Anchorage Foundation of Texas and the foremost authority on everything Houston. He is the author or co-author of many books, including The Country Houses of John Staub, The Comprehensive Houston Architectural Guide, and most recently with Barry Scardino Bradley and Michelangelo Sabatini, Making Houston Modern, a wonderful book on the life and work of the important Houston architect, Howard Barnstone. Stephen's breadth of knowledge and research on the architectural and urban history of Houston goes beyond just an understanding of the physical and urban artifact to address the social, cultural, and regional influences that shaped this great city of ours. In the long ago days of inviting guests to travel to Houston to give a lecture here or to teach, one of the great enticements was the promise of a legendary tour of Houston by Stephen. And I have to say that that promise worked all the time. Finally, in my tradition of Googling faculty to make these introductions, which admittedly doesn't work quite as well in Zoom as it did in person last year, I looked up Stephen Fox, and of course came up with many different ones, including historians, painters, and a clarinet maker or two. But what struck me the most was that there was an announcement of this lecture on the front page of the Visit Houston website, the official Houston tourism site, indicating that this was the highlight of things to do in Houston today. I think we can all agree that this is a great testament to the importance of Stephen Fox's authoritative voice in the city of Houston. So please join me in welcoming Stephen, who is actually speaking to us today as if we were all in the Farish Gallery. So Stephen, it's all yours.
I want to thank Dean John Kasparian, Program Committee Chairs, Professors Sarah Nichols and Brittany Udding, and their committee members, including Ruisi Zhang, for inviting me to participate in the Fall 2020 Noon Talks. I especially want to acknowledge the extraordinary job Dean Kasparian, and the staff and faculty of the School of Architecture have done in bringing us into this semester under very stressful circumstances. The convergence of a public health crisis and the crisis in public confidence caused by continuing police and vigilante violence against people of color in the United States can well cause those of us who dwell in the privileged insulation of the university to ask what the conjunction of these events means. Alumni and students of the School of Architecture pose these questions in a call to action delivered on June 19th, Juneteenth, demanding a reckoning with what their manifesto describes as symptoms of injustice and exclusion. Taking to heart the accusations conveyed by the call to action, I want to respond by drawing on my specialty, the history of architecture, to suggest ways to bring to the surface issues of race that are ever present in architecture but unacknowledged, or as the call to action phrases it, to contextualize architecture with the histories and cultures of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. I am not Black, Indigenous, or a person of color. Trying to find a way to frame my observations without presuming to speak for communities of color, tracing linkages and excavating the substratum of suppressed racial awareness, starting with where I'm standing, the Farish Gallery in Anderson Hall, customarily the site of the school's noon talks. You of course recognize James Sterling and Michael Wilford's stepped planes and receding spatial volumes, with which 40 years ago, they injected architectural life into a dull and listless building. Calling almost no attention to itself is the dedicatory plaque identifying the gallery as a memorial to Libby Rice Farish, whose foundation provided funds to help make Sterling and Wilford's transformation possible. Here in 1930 are the two Mrs. Farishes. On the left, Lottie Rice Farish, and on the right, her cousin, Libby Rice Farish. The Mrs. Farishes shared the Rice family name. They were great nieces of the 19th century Houston merchant, William M. Rice, whose fortune endowed Rice University. Their husbands were brothers. Lottie Rice was married to Stephen P. Farish, CEO of the Reed Roller Bit Company of Houston. And Libby Rice was married to William Stamps Farish, CEO first of the Humble Oil and Refining Company, and then of the Standard Oil Company of New Jersey. The Farish brothers also had a great uncle immortalized in bronze. Their paternal grandmother's brother, Jefferson Davis, seen here in Pompeo Copini's statue, originally part of the pantheon of Southern heroes, all white, presiding over the South Mall of the University of Texas at Austin. I'm not sure how many degrees of separation distance the Farish Gallery from the President of the Confederacy. But once you start burrowing beneath the surface, things can get squirmy awfully quick. Examining the setting for the University of Texas ensemble, the instrumental role of symmetry, centrality, and figuration in constructing a monumental landscape setting that systematically integrated Copini's heroic sculpture, the interventions of the university's architect, Paul Cray of Philadelphia, and the landscape architecture of Hare and Hare to shape a space that appeals and impresses because of its coherence, beauty, and its triumphal swagger. The same techniques of spatial orchestration were used by Rice University's architects, Cram, Goodhue, and Ferguson of Boston, to construct the monumental spatial order over which William M. Rice's statue presides, one that prevails at other sites of public commemoration, such as the San Jacinto Monument of 1939, a tribute to the Anglo-American seizure of Mexican Texas, projected onto the flat coastal plain landscape along the Houston Ship Channel. And the main axis of Herman Park focused on Enrico Ceracchio's bronze equestrian statue of Sam Houston, which punctuates the impressive sweep of spatial continuity implanted by the park's master planner, the St. Louis landscape architect, George E. Kessler. These are landscapes of power. They reflect the agenda of American cultural elites of the early 20th century progressive era, mobilizing symmetry, long passages of spatial continuity, and figures and symbols embodied in classical Roman typologies to incite human emotion and stir human admiration and identification. But, evident as Jefferson Davis leaves on vacation from UT's South Mall in 2015, the compelling authority of these mythic constructs is susceptible to critical questioning. These landscapes are also landscapes of white racial power, to deploy monumentality, awe, and beauty, to mask critical appraisal of their origins. Houston's rare surviving 19th century architectural landmarks. This is the house, built in 1851, that William M. Rice bought from his business partner, E.B. Nichols, in 1856, and occupied until 1863, are not customarily interpreted to emphasize the roles race played in their histories. Here, I borrow the technique devised by my former student, Ben Davis, of juxtaposing an excerpt from Schedule 1 of the US Census of 1860, enumerating the household of William M. Rice, with Thomas Flintoff's 1852 watercolor of Courthouse Square in downtown Houston, showing what is now called the Nichols Rice Cherry House in its original location to the left of the courthouse. I contrast the enumeration of Rice's household with Schedule 2 of the 1860 census, the slave schedule, which documents Rice's ownership of 15 enslaved people, 8 women and 7 men, 2 of them children. Unlike the members of Rice's household counted in Schedule 1, enslaved people were not enumerated by name or place of origin, but by owner, age, gender, and color. B stood for Black, M for mulatto or mixed race. Enslaved people were treated legally as though they were livestock. There is no place, such as the Nichols Rice Cherry House, with which to associate these people. Historians are unsure of what work, if any, they may have performed for Rice, since, as Dr. Susan Jackson, the historian of slavery in Houston, observed, and I'm quoting, most merchant houses, including William M. Rice and Company, accepted consignments of slaves from their customers for resale or in default of payment for goods. When William M. Rice transferred his cotton exporting operations from Civil War era Houston to Matamoros, Tamaulipas, Mexico, across the Rio Grande from Brownsville, Texas, early in 1864, he encountered a very different racial reality. Matamoros' central plaza is still dominated by the neoclassical parish church, Nuestra Señora del Refugio, built between 1821 and 1833, but severely damaged during a hurricane in 1844. Not until the mid-1850s were the church's facade and towers reconstructed by an architect from New Orleans who had immigrated to Matamoros in 1832, Bartolo Passeman. Research by Dr. Patricia Brady, Gregory Free, and Mary Gaiman confirms that Passeman was a free man of color, part of the diaspora of Creoles of color who came to Matamoros, Tampico, and Veracruz, Mexico, after Louisiana lawmakers began to limit their liberties and occupational opportunities. What these skilled immigrants encountered in Matamoros was a political and economic culture not constrained by race. Bartolo Pasema married a Mexican woman. One of their sons became mayor of Matamoros in 1891. Their daughter, the First Lady of Tamaulipas, when her husband served as governor of the state from 1901 to 1908. An American contemporary of William M. Rice, who settled permanently in Matamoros in 1857, was the South Carolina-born merchant John S. Cross, whose monument in Matamoros' Panteon Viejo you see here. While living in Lowndes County, Mississippi in the 1840s, Cross cohabited with an enslaved woman, Lydia, who became the mother of his children. By becoming Mexican and Catholic, Juan S. Cross could marry his wife and acknowledge their children. Cross's son and business partner, Middleton Hart Cross, called Meliton in Mexico, and enumerated as a slave in the US Census of 1850, built the grandest Victorian house in Matamoros in 1885 for his wife, Marie Edwige Lamarck, a Creole of color from New Orleans. At the turn of the 20th century, two of the Cross's sons, Enrique and Juan Samuel Cross, attended Harvard University. The prominence that American immigrants of color achieved in Matamoros exposed the fictitiousness of American racial ideology and the exploitative ends it served. Historian Susan Jackson infers the impact that enslaved African Americans had on Houston's building economy from the hostile reaction of the Houston Mechanics Association, which in 1858 resolved to condemn white journeymen who subcontracted with African American mechanics. Inasmuch as the census of 1860 enumerated fewer than 10 free people of color as living in Houston, it seems likely that the African American mechanics were themselves enslaved. Dr. Merlene Petrie has documented the political career of Richard Allen, an enslaved architect and builder, who after emancipation was elected to the Texas legislature in 1869 to represent Harris and Montgomery counties. Dr. Petrie quotes from an article in the July 6, 1870 edition of Houston's Republican newspaper, the Houston Union, which stated, and I'm quoting, "The finest and most elegant mansion that once graced our city, that of Mayor J.R. Morris, was the handiwork of Richard Allen while he was a slave, not the mere mechanics only, but the design, the draft, and all." The house standing on the Morris property at the corner of Bell Avenue and Crawford Street in the 1873 bird's eye map of Houston, framed by street trees, does not appear architecturally exceptional. But it demonstrates that enslaved African Americans worked, to their owner's profit, as skilled craftsmen as well as manual laborers. Richard Allen was the original architect and builder of Antioch Missionary Baptist Church, completed in 1879, and still standing at what is now downtown Houston. A report in the Houston Post newspaper identifies a second Black architect builder, Robert Jones of Houston, as responsible for the reconstruction of Antioch Church in 1892. Also dating from the first decade after emancipation is the Yates homestead, the home of another formerly enslaved Houstonian, the Reverend John Henry Yates. The Reverend Jack Yates, the first African-American pastor of Antioch Baptist Church, had this house constructed on property he acquired in 1869 in the Castanier addition in 4th Ward, then at the far west edge of Houston. Since 1994, it has been owned by the Heritage Society and now stands along with the Nichols Rice Cherry House in Sam Houston Park. Built in 1911, 40 years after the Yates homestead, the colonial revival style house of Dr. Benjamin J. Covington on Emancipation Avenue in 3rd Ward also lay at the edge of Houston when it was new, as Mrs. Covington recalled in an interview in the Houston Post in 1963. One of the first events held in the Covington's new house, occasioning this photograph, was a reception for Booker T. Washington when he spoke in Houston in September 1911. The Wright Land Company, a real estate company under white ownership, developed a subdivision of Independence Heights in 1910 at what was then the far north end of North Main Street. The company sold lots to African-American buyers. In 1915, African-American residents of Independence Heights and neighboring subdivisions secured a charter of incorporation from the state of Texas to become Independence Heights, Texas, the first African-American municipality in Texas. G.G. Burgess, who owned the General Merchandise Company, the remains of which you see on the left, was elected Independence Heights' first mayor. Like other small towns on the edge of Houston, Independence Heights waived its charter of incorporation in 1928 to seek annexation by Houston because its tax base was not sufficient to fund the state's municipal public service requirements. One sees that despite the systematic suppression of African-American political participation and the systematic extension of segregation as a matter of law, which began in the 1890s in Texas and accelerated during the first decade of the 20th century, Black Houstonians did not acquiesce in ascriptions of inferiority. The efforts of African Americans in Houston to demonstrate economic advancement and social respectability are documented in the Red Book of Houston, published in 1915, the year Independence Heights was incorporated. The Red Book was a business and social directory, a type of promotional publication popular at the turn of the 20th century. The business directory section contains a list of African-American contractors and builders, and the text recounting the history of Houston's African-American community recognized the architect and builder Robert Jones, as well as such contemporary building professionals as Joseph H. Jackson, who had recently constructed a new church building for Trinity Methodist Church, Houston's oldest African-American congregation. A point of pride in the Red Book's narrative was construction of Houston's colored Carnegie Library in 4th Ward in 1912-13, across the street from Antioch Church. Because of the advocacy of Black educators, pastors, and businessmen, the Carnegie Endowment of New York awarded a construction grant, and Houston's mayor, H. Baldwin Rice, William M. Rice's nephew, committed the city to fund operation of the library, inasmuch as Black Houstonians were barred by segregation law from using the Houston Lyceum and Carnegie Library, the city's taxpayer-supported public library. The colored Carnegie Library was designed by the foremost African-American architect in the South, W. Sidney Pittman of Washington, D.C., the son-in-law of Booker T. Washington. San Antonio architect, landscape architect, and historian Everett L. Fly has been instrumental in recovering Pittman's reputation. In 1912, the year he received the Houston Library Commission, Sidney Pittman moved his practice to Dallas. Pittman was called back to Houston to design the Oddfellows Building of 1924, subsequently the Atlanta Life Building, for an African-American fraternal organization, and Wesley Chapel African Methodist Episcopal Church on Emancipation Avenue of 1926. Wesley Chapel is the only one of Pittman's Houston buildings still standing, and the congregation has recently listed it for sale. Pittman seems to have been the only African-American building professional to practice as an architect in Texas in the 1910s and 20s. Claude Leonard Wilson, director of the School of Mechanical Arts at what is now Prairie View A&M University, a mechanical engineer by training, collaborated with A&M's consulting architect F.E. Giesecke on the design of L.C. Anderson Hall at Prairie View of 1933. Civics for Houston, the magazine published for 1 year in 1928 by Will C. Hogg's Forum of Civics, devoted one of its monthly issues to Houston's colored citizens, headlined with an article by C.F. Richardson, publisher and editor of the Houston Informer newspaper. The issue also highlighted Jessie Covington Dent, Dr. and Mrs. Covington's daughter, a graduate of Oberlin College, and like Will Hogg's sister, Ima Hogg, a concert pianist. Although African Americans in Houston were sometimes reported on respectfully in local publications, such editorial treatment could not be depended on. Sarcasm and mocking stereotypes, especially in the form of coarse humor, constantly reinforced white ascriptions of inferiority. J.S. Cullinan, founder of the Texas company, Texaco, donated funds to construct Houston Negro Hospital of 1926 on top, and the adjoining Lucy Holm Cullinan School of Nursing of 1931 below, on Ennis Street in 3rd Ward. But because there were so few African-American Houstonians who could afford to pay for professional health care, the hospital struggled financially, especially during the Depression, when the nursing school had to close. The ambivalence of liberal white Houstonians is striking. They implicitly recognized the injustice of segregation, but did not challenge it, emphasizing instead the need for an equal distribution of resources in compliance with segregation's separate but equal legal formula. The report of the City Planning Commission, published in 1929 by Will Hogg's Forum of Civics, addressed the issue of racially restricting neighborhood development. As early as 1907, Houston real estate developers began to use the new legal instrument of deed restrictions to exclude African Americans from ownership or occupancy of property in restricted subdivisions. One of the city planning report's 2 maps on the left represents the as-is condition, showing the major concentrations of Black residential settlement in Houston in 1929. Here is downtown, so to the west, 4th Ward, to the southeast, 3rd Ward, and then to the northeast, 5th Ward. The right-hand map shows the as it should be condition, and in which you will notice 4th Ward sort of dramatically shrinks in size. The text accompanying these maps stated that the US Supreme Court had ruled in 1917 that zoning could not be used for the purpose of racial exclusion. What this seemingly futile exercise underscores was the anxiety felt by developers of elite Houston residential real estate in the 1920s, once they realized that the path of African American residential expansion, especially in 3rd Ward, was headed in their direction. Will Hogg was not only the founder of the Forum of Civics, he was also the developer of River Oaks and chair of the City Planning Commission. The impact of systematic racial segregation is visible in the phenomenon of uneven development. In Houston's African American wards, patterns of mixed-use urbanization, typical of the 19th century city, persisted well into the 20th century. Despite the development of deed-restricted neighborhoods oriented to middle-income Black families in the post-Second World War period, Park Court in the 2900 to 3100 blocks of St. Emmanuel Street in 3rd Ward, developed in 1946, and the expansive Pleasantville community, developed between the Houston Ship Channel and Market Street Road in 1949-50. The mixed-use pattern dominated, as can still be seen on Emancipation Avenue in 3rd Ward and Lyons Avenue in 5th Ward. Uneven development was also evident in architecture, where traditional typologies continued to be built, such as the twin-towered churches associated with James M. Thomas, a mechanical drawing teacher at Phyllis Wheatley High School in Fifth Ward, who initiated a side career as a building designer and contractor. This is Thomas's St. John Baptist Church on Gray Avenue in Third Ward of 1946. In 1937, the year James Thomas began his construction business, the state of Texas adopted a law requiring anyone calling him or herself an architect to pass a state-administered qualifying exam. James Thomas was never registered as an architect, although such students of his as Willie C. Jordan Jr. would be. Project row houses on Holman Avenue in Third Ward, built between 1939 and 1941 by an Italian-American farmer and real estate investor, Frank Cash, displays the effects of uneven development in its bungalow detailing, very old-fashioned by the 1930s. Cash's repeating gabled house fronts, built 4 to a lot, 2 facing Holman and 2 facing the back alley, represented a standard typology for rental housing for African-American families in Houston, based on the prototype of the shotgun cottage. Just how persistent this typology was and how it could be flexibly adapted to changing market conditions is evident in this cluster of ranch-style brick veneer cottages on Elroy Street in Fifth Ward from around 1950. The market's provision for rental housing for working families contrasted sharply with the architecture of New Deal reform of the 1930s. CUNY Homes, the first public housing complex built by the Housing Authority of the City of Houston, was constructed on what was then the south edge of Third Ward in 1939-40, at the same time as the Frank Cash Row. A concrete frame construction with brick-faced tile block walls and steel sash windows, CUNY Homes, like all public housing in the South until the end of the 1960s, was racially segregated. Its dedication to Norris Wright CUNY of Galveston, Texas' leading late 19th century Republican political figure, the son of a Waller County planter and an enslaved mother, coded the complex as housing for African-American families. CUNY Homes is where George Floyd lived for much of his life. What stands out in comparing the Cash Row and Project Row houses to CUNY Homes is the architectural regimentation thought appropriate for both, in contrast to the architectural assertions of individuality associated with middle and upper income housing. In 1944, the Houston Independent School District acquired a 53-acre tract on Cleburne Avenue across from CUNY Homes as a permanent campus for Houston's public college for African-American students, Houston College for Negroes. In 1947, the University of Houston transferred ownership of this site to the state of Texas. It is where, in 1947, Fairchild Hall, there on the upper left, the first building at what would become Texas Southern University, Houston's first state university, was completed. 10 years earlier, the architect Lamar Q. Cato had designed the University of Houston's first buildings. Cato would also design Texas Southern's first buildings. Texas Southern University was absorbed into the state's complex of higher education institutions in order to thwart the legal challenge that a Houston postal worker, Heman Sweat, launched in 1946 after he was denied admission to the University of Texas Law School, then the only state university law school in Texas, because Sweat was African American. Sweat lost his lawsuit and his appeal in Texas. But in 1950, the US Supreme Court reversed these lower court decisions and ordered the University of Texas to admit Sweat, because there was no law school at Prairie View, then the only state college in Texas that admitted African Americans. It was Sweatt's lawsuit that caused the state of Texas to acquire Houston College for Negroes and elevate it to the status of a state university equipped with a law school in order to undercut Sweatt's legal challenge and preserve racial segregation. Texas Southern University provided the economic foundation supporting the emergence of a substantial Black middle class in Houston in the 1950s. One beneficiary was the second African-American graduate student after Hines Sweatt to enroll at the University of Texas in the fall of 1950, John S. Chase, a World War II veteran from Annapolis, Maryland. On becoming the University of Texas' first African-American graduate in 1952 in architecture, Chase and his wife, Drusy Rucker, moved to Houston, where John Chase became an assistant professor at Texas Southern University, teaching drafting and mechanical drawing. This enabled him to launch a career designing buildings, even before becoming the first African-American registered architect in Texas in 1954. John Chase's early work, such as Shiloh Missionary Baptist Church on Lyons Avenue in 5th Ward of 1955, displays his admiration for the Usonian modern architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright. Chase was the architect of choice for the post-war generation of African-American professionals and community leaders, not only in Houston, but in Bay City, Texas, where he designed Dr. William H. Hadnot Jr.'s clinic of 1960. In Beaumont, where he was the architect of St. James United Methodist Church of 1960. In Austin, where he designed David Chapel Missionary Baptist Church of 1959, the Thompson House of 1963, and the Phillips House of 1965. The Phillips House shares its folded plate roof structure with Chase's Riverside National Bank in 3rd Ward of 1963, the first Black-owned bank in Texas. John Chase designed many churches, one of which is the Episcopal Church of St. Luke the Evangelist of 1961, adjacent to Texas Southern University's campus. Historian Dr. Fred L. McGee discovered that John Chase's thesis project at the University of Texas was for a model church and community center for an African-American congregation. In 1967, John Chase was appointed consulting architect to Texas Southern University. There he designed the Martin Luther King Jr. Humanities Building of 1969, with sculptor Carol Harris Sims' African Queen Mother in front, the Ernest S. Sterling Student Center of 1976, and also from 1976, the Thurgood Marshall School of Law building, honoring the Baltimore lawyer and Supreme Court justice, who successfully argued not only Hines Sweatt's case before the US Supreme Court, but the earlier Smith versus Allwright case, filed in Houston and decided in 1944, which outlawed the exclusion of African-American voters from party primary elections in Texas. Thurgood Marshall additionally argued the 1948 Supreme Court case of Shelley versus Kramer, resulting in the court's ruling that racial exclusionary clauses and subdivision deed restrictions were not legally enforceable. This dissolved the legal obstacle preventing middle-income African-American families from buying houses in the upper middle-income white neighborhoods south of the Texas Southern University campus, as John Schwartz documents in his 1987 film, This Is Our Home, It Is Not For Sale. From 1959 until his death in 2012, John Chase lived in the house he designed and built for his family in one of these formerly whites-only neighborhoods. The Chase House, now the subject of a monograph by Austin architect and University of Texas architecture professor David Heyman, published by the University of Texas Press, marks the extraordinary determination and achievement of the mid-century generation of African American leaders in the South. Through moral authority, collective action, and personal sacrifice, they compelled US courts and the US Congress to dismantle the legal structure of racial segregation. As David Heyman makes clear in his book, the Chase House was very much a family home. It is where Mr. and Mrs. Chase entertained with flair in the central atrium that John Chase created by adding a second story to the house in 1968 and roofing over what had originally been an open-air courtyard. This is the corridor of the John T. Biggers Art Center at Texas Southern University, where fine arts students, as part of their degree requirements, paint a public mural. The expressive, gestural character of many of the murals reflects the impact of John Biggers, a contemporary of John Chase's, who, with the sculptor Carol Sims, founded the art department at Texas Southern University in 1949. John Biggers was inspired in part by the social art of the Mexican painter Diego Rivera, whose Detroit industry murals of 1932-33 you see here at the Detroit Institute of Arts, designed by Paul Cray, the architect of the University of Texas campus in Austin. Diego Rivera purposefully subverted Cray's hierarchical classical frames to celebrate, in this repository of old world, old masters, Detroit's 20th century Black, brown, and white industrial working class. Diego Rivera's first significant public art patron had been the Mexican cultural visionary, José Vasconcelos. In 1925, Vasconcelos published an essay, The Cosmic Race, dialectically reversing the ideology of racial purity on which the American system of racial segregation was based, asserting instead that racial and cultural fusion provided the most secure foundation on which humankind might build a better, more just world. The ecstatic democratic ethos of Rivera's Detroit murals also emanates from John Biggers' Christia Via Dare mural in Christia Via Dare County Park of 1984. In his work of the 1980s, John Biggers iconified the shotgun cottage, treating each front porch like a classical edicula, an architectural frame ceremonially enshrining a venerated figure, to transform the daily lives and settings of Black Houston into what art historian Dr. Alvia J. Wardlaw describes as a vast narrative epic. In founding Project Row Houses in 1994, the artist Rick Lowe and his colleagues, Deborah Grotefeld and Michael Caranto, with the support of many volunteers, such as architect Cheryl Tucker de Vasquez, translated Biggers' iconography into a multifaceted program addressing the relationship of art making and art exhibition to community involvement, social service provision, neighborhood revitalization, historic preservation. Project Row Houses acquired and preserves the El Dorado Ballroom of 1939, as well as the production of architecture that is innovative and socially responsible. Here, Construct, formerly the Rice Building Workshop's Zero House of 2009 on the left, and the Extra Small House of 2003 on the right. In the 21st century, a new generation of African-American headed architectural firms has emerged to join the mainstream of professional practice. Christus N. Powell and his firm, Architectnics III, architects of the Church of St. Mary of the Purification in Riverside of 2000. Terry D. Smith of Smith & Company, architects of the City of Houston's African American Library at Gregory School in 4th Ward of 2010, and the restoration of the Deluxe Theater in 5th Ward of 2015. James B. Harrison of Harrison Kornberg, which designed the West Houston STEM Institute of 2017 for Houston Community College. The celebrated Durham, North Carolina architect, Phil Freelon, who in 2014 5 years before his untimely death, merged his firm with Perkins and Will, with whom he was associated on the dramatic transformation of Emancipation Park in 2017 and the new Worship and Education Center for Wheeler Avenue Baptist Church, now under construction in 3rd Ward. The Houston office of Moody Nolan, based in Columbus, Ohio, designed the new Jack Yates High School in 3rd Ward of 2018, and Texas Southern University's Library and Learning Center of 2019. Hines Architecture and Design, headed by Rice Design Alliance board member Damian S. Hines, won the 2019 international competition for the Jamaica Houses of Parliament in Kingston, designed in association with Kingston architect Evan Williams. The London-based architect, Sir David Adjaye, who, with Phil Freelon, Davis Brody Bond, and the Smith Group, was architect of the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. of 2016, designed the Ruby City Art Museum in San Antonio of 2019. And Zilla Gilmore, Assistant Director for Project Management and Engineering in Rice University's Facilities, Engineering, and Planning Department, and former Rice Design Alliance Board President, Nicholas Springer of Kirksey Architects, both of whom participated in this semester's first Noon Talk, are Houston architects who work within larger professional collectives. While the big picture may be one of African American assimilation into an admittedly mythical middle-class American mainstream, daily details are a harsh reminder of the power and pervasiveness of white racism. I found out how emotionally explosive even an attempted discussion of the contemporary consequences of white racism can be at a talk given by Dr. Ron Goodwin, Associate Professor of History at Prairie View A&M University at the Heritage Society in June 2018. Dr. Goodwin analyzed debates about removing Confederate monuments from a historical perspective. He demonstrated how, for many African Americans, the symbols these monuments present are live symbols, precisely because they are being claimed by white racist and separatist groups and are associated with the recriminations African Americans continue to experience, such as police shootings, rates of incarceration, income and opportunity disparities, and now susceptibility to the coronavirus. The outraged reaction to Dr. Goodwin's observations by some audience members necessarily entails rejection of what the School of Architecture's poster for this series describes as our collective need to acknowledge and understand systemic racism in order to counter it. The question of meaning that my title raises suggests that the answers to the historical problems of white racism and related pathologies of class, ethnic, and gender discrimination require a torturous, confusing, collective unlearning of the ideological habits and assumptions of privilege that being born with white flesh entails. In a recent presentation, my colleague in the School of Architecture, Dr. Reto Geiser, asserted that history and theory provide critical and timely methodologies for tackling difficult social questions. I hope that in seeking to contextualize architecture of the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries with the history and cultures of African American Houston, even in a selective and superficial way, I can begin to contribute to this process. In closing, I copycat Professor Jesus Basallo, who concluded his noon talk by illustrating his recommended reading. My recommendation is a pair of mystery novels, Blackwater Rising of 2010 and Pleasantville of 2016, both set in Houston and both written by Attica Locke. In addition to being a captivating storyteller, Attica Locke also gives her readers a personal and critical insight into the lives of her African American characters in contemporary Houston. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your wonderful lecture, Stephen. So now let's move on to the Q&A part. I have a personal question for myself. So after Hurricane Harvey, a lot of African American and colored community, for example, the community you mentioned, Independent Heights, they're facing problem of green gentrification. So I just wonder, how can Houston learn from the similar experience in other city? Or
I think that is a problem. I'm certainly aware from my few visits to Independence Heights that it is under a lot of stress, and I guess most recently from the proposal to expand Interstate 45. I think it's very difficult in Houston to begin to kind of build these sort of grassroots initiatives to resist these efforts. I prepared a more extensive reading list to accompany my remarks, which is being distributed. And it includes references to such works as Dr. Bullard's work at professor at the Texas Southern University, looking at the consequences of environmental racism in Houston and beyond. So there are resources in Houston, but still it is a very difficult task.
Another question, where and how 19th century Black architects learned architecture?
Well, I guess at the School of Architecture at Rice University, if I understood the question correctly, how can students today interested in architecture learn how to become architects?
Yeah, in the 19th century.
I think often in high school or even earlier, exploring programs that I know the WonderWorks at the University of Houston, the American Institute of Architects, and other agencies and institutions have devised in order to give high school students information about the architecture profession and how to sort of intersect with that, especially to enter architecture school.
Question from anonymous attendee. He said, just to clarify, you said the state adopted a whole university to avoid admitting a Black student at UT Law. Is that true?
Yes.
Another question from anonymous attendee. What is the intersection between market-driven development in Houston and efforts to ameliorate the effects of earlier housing development segregation?
Oh, that's a tough one. I'm not sure as an architectural historian that I'm really qualified to answer that. I'm also not really sure that the kind of market-driven housing production really kind of addresses those social questions.
Another question from anonymous attendee. What are some of the resources you recommend us to learn more about the history and architecture of the Third Ward?
Well, as I mentioned, I prepared an extensive bibliography kind of listing the resources, mostly published resources, some online resources that I'm aware of, dealing with the architecture, with the history of the African-American community in Houston. And I had never really prepared that kind of listing before, and I was really amazed at how much information is out there. The problem, as always in Houston, is just sort of bringing it together. So I hope that this bibliography will be one way in which people interested in these questions can begin to see what resources are available.
So another question from anonymous attendee. Can you reiterate any buildings by African-American architects in Houston that are currently at risk of being torn down or lost?
Well, one that I mentioned in the talk was Wesley Chapel, African Methodist Episcopal Church on Emancipation Avenue. It has been put up for sale, which is usually not a good sign for a religious congregation. Also, St. John Missionary Baptist Church, perhaps the most monumental of the churches on Emancipation Avenue and Third Ward, has also been put up for sale. it is where I learned in doing research, which I had not known, it is the first place that the Reverend Martin Luther King spoke in Houston in 1958. So it is not only historically significant because of its presence there in Third Ward, also very architecturally significant, but as a site associated with Dr. King, one of the 4 occasions that he visited Houston.
Thank you. Question from Stefan Piankny. What was the role and influence of the oil and gas sector on Houston African Americans?
Well, you know, that is a question I do not really know the answer to. I think it's probably a question that deserves a lot of exploration, because obviously the impact of the energy industry in Houston is quite crucial. So I think that is certainly a topic that warrants further research.
So a lot of people ask for the extensive reading list you provide. Just to clarify, the list has been shared with the students, and we can also share it with everyone who attended. So question from Sarah Nichols. You opened your lecture by shedding light on the familial links to white supremacism in the spaces that we, during non-pandemic semesters, inhabited daily. As RSA plans the expansion, does this offer a potential site to rethink naming conventions? Could we, for example, think of inaugurating a John S. Chase lecture hall?
Well, I think that's certainly a great suggestion. I think to name components of the School of Architecture for the outstanding architects of Houston is one way to begin for this architecture institution to really recognize and celebrate the outstanding leaders of the profession. And Mr. Chase was definitely one of them.
Thank you. Another question from anonymous attendee. He said, thank you for the talk. Can you comment on the process, on the pipeline between educating minority students and actually them obtaining licensing and practicing? Is there a missing link?
Well, again, as a historian, I have tended not to be involved with that process. So probably, well, certainly for me there was, because I started out as an architecture student and ended up as an architectural historian. But I think for architecture schools, this effort to work with not only alumni, but also interns in the cities where the schools are located is an important way for the schools of architecture to begin to exercise community influence and kind of continue their educational mission beyond simply granting degrees.
Question from anonymous attendee. He or she said, great lecture. Are there similarly captivating stories to tell at some other time which involve Houston's other racial and or gender minorities?
Yes, that was the hour-and-a-half portion that I cut out of the lecture. So definitely, there are many opportunities to explore, again, the kind of substrate of architectural history in Houston, fascinating personalities and fascinating works of architecture.
Thank you. Another question. From your experience, what are the best channels to make the revealing racial histories of the planning of Houston available to the public elected officials with the power to undo the wrongs through policy? How can architects participate in crucial policy making?
Well, I think that's a question that architects ask themselves all the time. And certainly in a school of architecture, there is much concern over the perceived powerlessness of architects. With, again, sort of resorting to Professor Reto Geiser's remark about the potential that history and theory offer, I think by investigating the kind of patterns and practices of power, especially as it affects the production of architecture, is a way in which architecture students and architecture professors can become more aware of how decisions are made. The process, though, of kind of breaking into that decision-making circle is a kind of occult one. And it is, again, one I think that occasions a lot of questioning and uncertainty within architecture schools.
Question from Deb Hardy. How was funding secured by well-to-do Blacks in Houston prior to a Black-funded bank? Did they have to rely on cash to finance the process?
That's a great question, and it's one that I don't know the answer to, but it is an issue that pertains, I think, to many working class minorities who do not have the access to institutions of finance. So it is one in which, again, more historical work needs to be done to understand how business people were able to accumulate wealth and then translate it into such institutions as chartering banks. Mr. Fairchild, for whom Fairchild Hall, the first building at Texas Southern University, was named, is sort of a case in point. I think he began as a small businessman. He owned a funeral home and several other small businesses, and from that accumulated what was a very respectable fortune by the time of his death in the 1940s. And that's what enabled then his widow to make a substantial contribution for the construction of Fairchild Hall. So often these are really kind of fascinating stories about how these determined people use their natural abilities to overcome so many obstacles to prosper in a very stressful culture.
Thank you, Stephen. Another question from Sarah Nichols. The redlining maps show an intention not just to restrict the size of Black neighborhoods, but they are also separated from each other as islands within the fabric of whiteness. Was this intentional? Are there consequences within the city as a result of this?
The formation of African American neighborhoods in Houston, again, is another sort of fascinating historical topic. What seems to be the case, as historians observe, that after the end of the Civil War and emancipation, as African Americans began to come to towns and cities, the places that people were able to find housing was usually on the edge of the city. And so in 4th Ward, 3rd Ward to the southeast of downtown, 5th Ward to the northeast of downtown, in the 1860s and 1870s, those were the edges of Houston. I think they also afforded some access to places of employment, so that whole process was one of sort of accident, I think, more than any kind of official planning. But again, it's intriguing to see how those communities became kind of very strongly focused. And certainly in such fields as popular music, rhythm and blues kind of formed cultures that now Houston is really well known for. The practice of redlining, and there are maps that the Kinder Institute has prepared, applying the historical information derived from the redlining records to street maps of Houston. And it really looks quite similar to that 1929 map from the report of the City Planning Commission. So again, what it really suggested was that those were the parts of Houston that banks and other building corporations did not loan money in. And it very consistently was also the major areas of African American settlement.
Thank you. Another question from Craig Anthony Thomas. Rice University president recently announced the naming of the mid-campus plaza for the Rev. William Lawson of Wheeler Avenue Missionary Baptist Church. What do you think of the honor and the space?
What is the last part of the question?
What do you think the honor and the space? What do you think of the honor and the space?
Dr. Lawson is certainly an outstanding figure, and it is, I think, it's always wonderful to honor a person when they're still here to be honored. So I'm very glad that Rice University is paying tribute to Dr. Lawson. One of the kind of historical documents I came across is a video report that his daughter Melanie Lawson prepared about Dr. King's last visit to Houston in 1967. And it was very sort of moving to see then a very young Dr. Lawson sort of standing next to Dr. King and realizing again that there are these quite extraordinary giants of 20th century American history who are still very much with us.
Thank you. Question from Anne Ernett. Has Houston been better or worse than other growing metropolitan cities in using multi-racial professional architects? If worse, what other cities have done better?
Well, I've not really done the comparative analysis to be able to answer that question. It is very interesting to see that if you go to the websites of the architecture firms that I mentioned, how often their major clients are local institutions. And I think to me, that's very important. Looking at the kind of history of American architecture from the mid-20th century to the present, what I'm aware of is the extent to which local institutions are usually the architect's best clients. And through the last half of the 20th century and into the 21st century, I think what one sees is a dramatic erosion of institutions of local control. And with that, also the extent to which architects kind of face a diminishing client base. So these local institutions, particularly educational institutions, are very much to be commended for employing not only minority architects, but really local architects, and for ensuring then that there is a kind of fair and just distribution of architectural commissions rather than sort of concentrating them for a favored few firms.
Thank you. Question from Nat Leeser. Do you have any proposals for within the Rice School of Architecture, changing reading lists, changing the pedagogy, etc.?
Well, as a lecturer, I usually don't participate in those decisions, but I am very aware of the serious commitment that Dean Kasparian has made to taking very seriously the kinds of issues identified in the call to action this past June, and taking steps to begin to examine the culture of pedagogy in the School of Architecture and to answer in a constructive way many of the issues raised in that call to action.
Thank you. Question from anonymous attendee. What is the intersection between market-driven development in Houston and the efforts to, oh, I'm sorry, we've answered this already. Another question from anonymous attendee. Are there any other books you would recommend on emergent advocacy in architecture and historical precedents?
I've probably been so focused on this issue that I have not kind of looked more broadly, but I think that is certainly a very fruitful topic to explore. And one observation I would make, and particularly my response to the call to action from June, is that concerned alumni and students shouldn't just wait for the school and the faculty to begin to address these issues. I think that we all have the capacity to address these issues. In Houston, everything is very random. And so you have to kind of pick out all the random pieces and construct a bigger picture. And I think we are all capable of doing that. So when you are frustrated because there is not a source to go to that will deliver the kind of information that you're looking for, that is your clue that you need to bring that information together and become that source. And the great thing about Houston is you can do it.
Thank you so much. Because we're running out of time, there are a lot of great questions, but we are only able to ask one last one. The question is from Stefan Piekny. In late 50s to 60s, there was a wide flight from certain neighborhoods to further out suburbs. Third Ward and Bracewood is one example. I live in Charlotte, NC, where similar pattern is now being reversed. Is something like this happening in Houston?
Yes, I mean, it's very dramatic in Third Ward and Fifth Ward, these traditional African-American neighborhoods, while Fourth Ward too. In fact, poor Fourth Ward has almost been obliterated, not just as an African-American neighborhood, but as a low-income neighborhood. And what is striking to me is that, I would say prior to the mid-1990s, middle-income white people would not have been willing to live in a predominantly African-American neighborhood. Since the mid-1990s, that attitude has changed. Well, obviously in a way that's very positive, but at the same time, it means that these inner city, lower income African-American neighborhoods were in a way sort of protected by prejudice. And now that that prejudice has dissolved, developers go in there, buy out the property, and usually the people who live there do not own their own property. So there's very little legal recourse that renters have if someone buys the property and evicts them. And this is kind of hastening the transformation of Third Ward and Fifth Ward. And it's really quite visually striking to see the number of new townhouses, townhouse complexes that are being built in these two parts of Houston.
Thank you so much. And thank you for everyone who asked the question.